He has supervised over 40 postgraduate students, including fellowships, master and doctoral degrees. Professor Kolawole is the current president of the Association of Clinical Endocrinologists of Nigeria, the immediate past vice president, Endocrine and Metabolism Society of Nigeria, immediate past head of the endocrinology, diabetes, and metabolism subspecialty of the Faculty of Internal Medicine, West African College of Physicians. Professor Kolawole is the current provost of the College of Health Sciences. And before assuming this office in August 1, 2021, he had previously served as Vice Dean, Faculty of Clinical Sciences. Between 2008 and 2011, was head of the Department of Dermatology and Venereology and head Department of Medicine. He currently sits on the management board of the Obafemiolo University Teaching Hospital, Ile-Ife. I want to sincerely invite the inaugural lecturer, Professor Babatope Ayodeji Kolawole, to present his lecture. Thank you very much.
Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, distinguished audience, I begin with the preamble. I return all the glory to the Almighty God for the great privilege given me to deliver the 367th inaugural lecture of the Obafemi University, Ile-Ife, this 10th day of January 2023. Like all other milestones in life, today has been much anticipated, perhaps even more by family members, friends, and well-wishers. Attaining the status of a professor not only implies reaching the highest rung of the academic ladder, teachers, it also carries with it the inevitable burden of being able to state in clear language one's contribution to knowledge in general and specific terms. This is the actual professing. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, I shall, in the time allotted for this lecture, be taking us through my journey in the academia, one straddling research, teaching, and service. The beginning. While thanking God that today I'm a professor of internal medicine and endocrinology, I'm not so sure I envisaged this in my early years. Perhaps a neutral observer would describe the course of events culminating in the outcome as fortuitous. With the benefit of hindsight, however, and deeper understanding, it is not difficult to see the divine subtly prodding me and working out his purpose. I can't agree more with the words of the psalmist when he sang, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained were written in your book before one of them came to be." Without doubt, I could be considered educationally advantaged to have been raised in a university environment. I recall with nostalgia the thorough and wholesome foundational education we received at the Unified Staff School in the early and mid-70s. Our teachers were thoroughbred and left no stone unturned, ensuring that we turned out well. University facilities such as the sports complex, and in fact, this Oduduwa Hall where we were at our disposal. Hence, attending Obafemi seemed like an expected progression. While on holidays from high school, I was taken through experiments in physics at the Part 1 laboratory in the science building. It was then coordinated by a friend of my dad, Dr. Michael Ishaud of blessed memory. He had returned to the UK in the late 80s, but ensured that my wife and I took the train from King Cross Station in London to visit him in Colchester whenever we were in town. Professor, then Dr. Soji Amire, saw to my chemistry practical, while my dad, Professor, then Dr. Kolawole, lecturer in physics, attended to mathematics and physics. Interestingly, biology, pathway to medicine, even though not given commensurate attention, became my favorite subject. The story of my journey to medical school will not be complete without the mention of Prof. Adebayo Adeyemo, who were our next door neighbor on Route 20C from 1976 to 1988, were the first healthcare providers that I knew at very close range. Prof was perpetually on call, or so I thought, because the ambulance from the hospital was always coming to pick him at odd hours. He also had a fat textbook of surgery in his living room, which to us then was full of fascinating pictures and images. He also had a way of carrying his jacket and stethoscope. His trademark American spec Volvo car is familiar to anyone that studied medicine in Ife in the 80s. It was with this same Volvo car that he drove me to the post-JAMB interview into medical school in August 1983. The interview, which held in the boardroom of the College of Health Sciences, had everyone shortlisted for admission into the Faculty of Health Sciences in attendance. As I was ushered into the room, I saw on the panel many familiar faces, notably Misho Yinka, who was then Dean, Professor Soji Oluwole, another family friend, and late Professor Badejo, another neighbor on Route 20C. The rest, as they say, is history. Endocrinology as a subspecialty of internal medicine. I will now proceed to answer a question I have had to answer several times over in the course of my career. What is endocrinology? It often begins like this. Which area of medicine did you specialize in? I then answer, internal medicine. I'm immediately requested to explain what internal medicine is about. I typically start from what most people appear to understand or are accustomed to, but almost opposite internal medicine, that is surgery, to explain the diagnosis and treatment of disease conditions using non-surgical means. Most people seem to then understand when I mention subspecialties of internal medicine, such as cardiology, chest medicine, or neurology, but still ask, what is endocrinology? Endocrinology is the study of the endocrine system in the human body. This is a system of glands which secrete hormones. Hormones are chemicals that affect the actions of different organ systems in the body. Examples include thyroid hormone, growth hormone, and insulin. The endocrine system involves a number of feedback mechanisms so that one action or release of another secondary hormone, such as thyroid hormone. In the original 1902 definition of Baylis and Sterling, they specified that to be classified as a hormone, the chemical must be produced by an organ, be released into the blood, and be transported by the blood to a distant organ to exert its function. This definition holds true for most classical hormones, but there are also paracrine mechanisms, autocrine signals, as well as intracrine signals. While it appears that the history of endocrinology as a scientific discipline is recent, the Holy Bible recorded a classical, albeit dramatic endocrine condition that is often overlooked. The 17th chapter of the book of 1 Samuel narrates the encounter between the young boy David and the giant Goliath. Goliath the Gittite is the most well-known giant in the Bible. He's described as a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. We gain further insight into his family from 1 Chronicles chapter 20. A literal interpretation of the verses suggests that his brother and 3 sons were also of giant stature. In fact, Goliath's 3rd son, it was said, had on every hand 6 fingers, and on every foot 6 toes. Goliath's family tree is suggestive of a hereditary autosomal dominant pituitary gene disorder called AIP2. Goliath was killed by David, who held a stone at his forehead. This gives further evidence that he suffered from pituitary gland dysfunction. A pituitary tumor pressing on his optic chiasma and consequent visual disturbance due to pressure on his optic nerve will have made it difficult for Goliath to see the stone approaching in his lateral field of vision. The stone sank into a skull already made vulnerable by osteitis and thinning of the facial bones. This was followed by bleeding into an already enlarged cellar with rapid development of pituitary apoplexy, which rendered him unconscious, though not dead. David completed the task by decapitating him. Providentially, David and his relations and men terminated the military careers of the giants, making it profoundly true that all power belongs to God. How does the endocrine system work? There are up to 40 different hormones circulating in the blood. Once released into the bloodstream, the hormone travels throughout the body until it reaches its specific destination to perform its function. At its target, it tells that part of the body what work to do, when to do it, and how long to do it. Hormonal function, therefore, is a balancing act. Too much or too little of one hormone can have an impact on the release of other hormones. This was aptly described by Professor Jerome Elushian in his inaugural lecture titled Between Too Little and Too Much, Unraveling the Mystery and Misery of Endocrine Disorders in Children. These imbalances can be corrected by the body itself. However, when this gets out of hand, then the services of an endocrinologist is required. Education and training in endocrinology. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, Professor Rosemary T. Ikem and I were the first set of endocrinologists to be trained here in Ife. Professor Ikem had passed the Part 1 examinations of National Postgraduate Medical College in 1994 and later proceeded to the Lagos University Teaching Hospital for subspecialty training in endocrinology. I passed the Part 1 exams of the West African College of Physicians in 1995 and later joined her in Lagos under the tutelage of Professor Augustine Owoworele and the late Professor T.O. Johnson. My dissertation, however, was supervised by Professor Bode Balogun and Professor Wale Akinshola. Upon our return from Lagos, and having been successful at the Part 2 examination, we were both appointed as Lecturer 1 and Honorary Consultants in 1999. Professor Ikem first in September, and then I in December. We started out as Honorary Consultant at the Wesley Guild Hospital, Ilesha, combining a heavy patient load with our teaching and research duties. I had aptly described my schedule in an invited contribution to the 100th issue of the Endocrinologist, the official newsletter of the British Society of Endocrinology in 2011. This is reproduced below. Endocrinology as a calling. While the term endocrinology subspecialty seems all-encompassing, endocrinology, diabetes, and metabolism, EGM, is now preferred because it captures in one breath the identical yet distinct aspects of a vast subspecialty. Researchers in this noble field are at the core of ameliorating and providing solutions to many of the most prevalent and pressing health challenges of our time, from diabetes and obesity to infertility, bone health, thyroid conditions, and hormone-related cancers. My main research interest has been in clinical endocrinology with a bias for diabetology and thyroidology. Most of my publications have thus been on either. I also have a secondary interest in malaria research, and I will now expatiate on this. Diabetes mellitus. The term diabetes mellitus is taken from the Greek word diabetes, meaning siphon or to pass through. And the Latin word mellitus means sweet. A review of the history shows that the term diabetes was first used by Apollonius of Memphis around 250 to 300 BC. Over the years, exceptional work has taken place and multiple discoveries, as well as management strategies, have been created to tackle this growing problem. Unfortunately, even today, diabetes is one of the most common chronic diseases in the world, leading to bitter outcomes for many sufferers, including limb amputation, blindness, stroke, heart attack, and kidney failure. We have contributed to the knowledge of the epidemiology of diabetes mellitus, mechanisms of diabetic complications, as well as the characterization and identification of factors influencing outcome in the management of diabetes mellitus, especially type 2 diabetes in our practice environment. I must not fail to mention that in the course of pursuing this, I have collaborated with a vast array of experts and professionals in related and not so related fields. These studies have continued to be cited in both local and international peer-reviewed journals. Diabetes epidemiology research. In an attempt to establish our own database and in line with the International Diabetes Federation recommendations, Professor Ekem and I opened a diabetes register at the outpatient clinic of the OAUTHC in Ife and Ilesha. We had hoped then that the register will, among others, serve as a tool for continuous quality assessment of diabetes care and serve as a tool for future research in diabetes. We therefore published our initial data in 2002, describing the demographic characteristics, clinical presentation, and associated medical problems or complications in newly presenting patients on the register. We found that the peak age at presentation was in the early 50s, and that majority of patients were traders. Type 2 diabetes was, of course, commoner, and they had a high prevalence of obesity and hypertension. Prevention. It was clear from our initial data set and from the observations of other colleagues that diabetes mellitus, thought to be a rarity amongst Africans by researchers in the 60s and 70s, had assumed the status of a disease of public health importance in not so long a time. Given the enormity of the illness burden placed by diabetes mellitus on the sufferer, family, and nation, we understood the need to deploy our research resources and strength towards prevention rather than the seemingly elusive cure. We were also not unmindful of the place of screening as a tool for diabetes prevention, especially primary prevention. A screening test is done to detect potential health disorders or diseases in people who do not have any symptoms or disease. For a disease condition to be regarded as preventable, the natural history of the condition should be adequately understood, as well as the parameters that measure its progression to disease. It must have a known treatment or intervention for those detected, and evidence that early intervention improves health outcomes. Further, the screening test of measurement should distinguish those individuals who are likely to have the condition from those who are unlikely to have it. Diabetes mellitus, Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, evidently fulfill these conditions. With the aim of preventing diabetes and its sequelae through screening and working together with colleagues in family medicine, we conducted an initial screening study to determine the prevalence of diabetes mellitus, its risk factors, and clinical characteristics in a Nigerian family practice population. We recommended routine screening of people at high risk of diabetes mellitus in our family practice with the glucometer, a relatively cheap office practice equipment. We subsequently forged a strong working relationship with our family physicians, which has endured till now. A 2010 report published in the Mayo Clinic Proceedings showed that primary care physicians treat at least 90% of the 24 million patients in the United States who are living with diabetes. Upskilling primary care physicians, therefore, in diabetes management in a recent Chinese study as an effective way to improve the standardized management of diabetes. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, permit me now us activities in the SITCANE study group. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So says an African. While several individual and institutional were been working on different aspects of diabetes mellitus, some of us were nudged into partnership. National Diabetes Study Group meeting held in Stellenbosch at the sidelines of the International Diabetes Federation meeting in Cape Town in December 2006. Somehow satisfied with the scanty representation of our country during the scientific session, some of us who were delegates from Nigeria had gathered during tea break to discuss next steps. Professor Jean-Claude Mbaya from the University of Yaoundé, who had partly facilitated my participation the night WHO diabetes seminar at the Clare College, Cambridge, earlier in July that year, also joined us. At that meeting, our Professor Christopher Alebioshu, who later became our coordinator and team lead, Professor Rosemary Ikem, Dr. Jokwadeleye from UCH, and Dr. William Balogun from UCH, as well as myself. We left that short meeting with a resolve to forge a research partnership that will alter the narrative on diabetes prevention and care. Upon our return home, we held a series of meetings at UCH Ibadan and on campus here in Ile-Ife at our own expense to develop a research agenda. After a series of name changes for our group, which we coined from the first two letters of the southwestern states in which we were practicing, we eventually settled for SITK, the strategies for improving diabetes care in Nigeria. Professor Ranti Familoni of Shagamu later joined the group. SITK activities, the Ogun project, number one priority was to develop a proposal that could attract funding. After a couple of rejections, we eventually won the World Diabetes Foundation grant, totaling $321,000 USD in 2008 to conduct the project entitled Strategies for Improving Diabetes Care. The project sought to improve prevention and control of diabetes in Ogun State, Nigeria. Our initial plan was to conduct activities in all Southwest states, but WDF advised us that we should take one state at a time. At the completion of the project in 2012, treatment guidelines on diabetes for health workers had been produced. Close to 400 healthcare providers had been trained, including lab scientists, pharmacists, and other paramedics. Approximately 1 million people were reached by awareness activities. In fact, that year also, we started what we call the SITK conference. These conferences were to later gain international acclaim, with the attendees coming from Europe and North America. Or your project, leveraging the successes recorded in the Ogun project, winning improving diabetes care in Oyo State in 2010 was not as challenging. The project, also funded by WDF to the tune of $467,000, sought to improve diabetes and hypertension care in Oyo State with the aim of preventing or delaying complications caused by diabetes. At project completion in 2014, among others, we had established 34 NCD clinics, that is non-communicable disease clinics. We had detected over 3,000 new cases of diabetes on our register. Over 160 doctors and several nurses and paramedics were also trained. In fact, on May 28, 2013, the Federal Ministry of Health declared free treatment for all children with type 1 diabetes mellitus in response to advocacy campaigns mounted by us and other groups. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, the Osun project, which we titled the Joint Action Against Gestational Diabetes in Osun State, to the tune of $376,000, came in 2013. The objective of the project was to reduce morbidity and mortality attributable to gestational diabetes, as well as ensuring better pregnancy outcomes in Osun State. Upon completion, 116 antenatal clinics were strengthened. Over close to 3,000 healthcare providers were trained in the care of GDM. 86,000 pregnant women were screened for GDM, and over 8,000 women with GDM were diagnosed and cared for. In addition to that, we also produced innovative ways of passing across diabetes education, including games and the like. We also published policy documents and documents to guide and strengthen physicians managing these conditions. Clinical features of diabetes. We have not only corroborated previous observations that measures of certain anthropometric indices are known to strongly associate with and may predict development of type 2 diabetes, we have also shown, perhaps for the first time in indigenous Nigerians, the association of short stature with type 2 diabetes mellitus. We had in that study determined the degree of body fatness, fat distribution, and body stature in a cross-sectional survey of newly presenting patients in our hospital. Also, in another study of 115 diabetics and over 2,000 blood donors, presented one of the earliest data on the seroprevalence of hepatitis C virus infection in Nigerians with diabetes mellitus. Further, we conducted a questionnaire survey of pulmonary function in male Nigerian diabetics using spirometric indices. In this study, we found that there were significantly worse lung function parameters in patients with diabetes when this is compared with predicted values. of the abnormal lung function findings for respiratory disease in diabetes remain unclear, however. Obstructive sleep apnea and diabetes mellitus are growing health challenges worldwide. We describe the prevalence and predictor of OSA in type 2 patients using a screening questionnaire. The regression model showed that for every 1 centimeter increase in neck circumference, there is a 56% commensurate independent increase in the likelihood of high risk of obstructive sleep apnea after adjusting for age, sex, body mass index, waist, hip circumferences, and blood glucose. A substantial proportion of our patients with type 2 diabetes may thus have obstructive sleep apnea, the key predictor being neck circumference after controlling for obesity. Mr. Vice Chancellor Sam, I received the World Diabetes Foundation grant to visit the Department of Endocrinology, University of KwaZulu-Natal, Durban, South Africa in 2008. During this stint, my host challenged me to conduct a chart review of their clinic patients with type 2 diabetes in a bid to familiarize myself with the electronic record system. In that study, we found a high proportion of abnormal liver function enzymes in South African Blacks and Indians with diabetes mellitus. In yet another investigation, we had demonstrated a high prevalence of asymptomatic bacteriuria in our diabetic patients, especially those with poor glycemic control. Diabetes treatment research. The mechanisms underlying diabetes and its treatment are intricately linked, hence requiring a multitude of interventions for successful disease management. In a previous study, we showed that while the current therapeutic monitoring strategies achieve significant BP and blood glucose lowering, very few patients attain recommended targets. We recommended intensification of current strategies and periodic evaluation of its effectiveness in achieving optimal targets. One other major contribution from this work was the development of a structured instrument for measuring and determining diabetes knowledge and practice amongst healthcare providers. This instrument has also been found useful by other researchers for the same purpose. We have also observed that many of our patients still possess the poor knowledge of their disease, and this impacted negatively on their adherence with medication. We also validated and developed an instrument for assessing patients' knowledge and compliance with treatment. Diabetes dietary treatment research. It was previously unclear whether dietary strategies and interventions which have been successful in the control of type 2 DM in Western nations will achieve the same effect in the African setting. To answer this question, we studied the effect of a formulated high-caloric fiber diet on the glycemic and lipid profile of tablet-treated type 2 Nigerian diabetics. We found that the consumption of a high-fiber diet, provided mainly through locally available soup thickeners and vegetables such as ugu, by newly diagnosed type 2 diabetic patients being treated with oral hypoglycemic agents, resulted in early attainment of normal glycemia and improved glycemic and lipid profile compared with a conventional diet. These findings underscore the need for our dietary guidelines to include specific recommendations on increased utilization of dietary fiber. Insulin therapy. We conducted the earliest comparative efficacy and safety study of insulin lispro, an analog insulin, and regular insulin in the management of hyperglycemic emergencies in Nigeria. 50 patients who presented in our hospital participated in the study. From that study, we concluded that lispro insulin is a safe and efficacious alternative to regular insulin in the treatment of hyperglycemic emergencies. Other interventions. In another study, we evaluated the effectiveness of a structured group education program on non-glycemic endpoints of diabetes knowledge, compliance with treatment and medical advice, use of monitoring devices, and treatment satisfaction. A cross-sectional comparative design was employed. Study participants were members of the local Diabetes Association of Nigeria who had participated in a structured group education program, which we compared with subjects who were outpatients who had type 2 diabetes, but had not participated in DAN activities and do not attend DAN meetings. Members of the Diabetes Association of Nigeria, DAN, had good knowledge of their disease, complied satisfactorily with their medications and physician's advice, knew and used at least one monitoring device, and had better knowledge of hyperglycemia and hypo than control subjects. Treatment satisfaction scores were also higher among DAN members. Diabetes Association and lay clubs, therefore, provide a practical and veritable acceptable means of disseminating diabetes-related information, and therefore should be strengthened. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, I will now proceed to discuss diabetes outcome research. We presented the earliest set of indigenous data on the factors that predict and determine intra-hospital mortality in patients with concurrent hypertension and diabetes mellitus. Predictive indices of intra-hospital mortality were statistically evaluated by comparison of proportions, chi-square test, Fisher's exact test, and logistic regression and analysis of variance. We found that mortality was higher in hypertensive diabetic patients than in non-hypertensive diabetics. And this was even more significantly so when male diabetics were compared to female diabetic patients. 50% of the deaths among non-hypertensive diabetics were associated with stroke. Prognostic factors to mortality in hypertensive NIDDM patients were male gender, hyperosmolar non-ketotic coma, associated stroke, and a Glasgow coma score at presentation of less than 10. We also found that after 2 years of follow-up, mortality rates dropped from 26.6% to 12.6%. This followed this aggressive antiplatelet and antihypertensive therapy, together with strict blood glucose control. Quality of life as an outcome measure. Quality of life and glycemic control are recognized independent outcomes, and one must not be achieved at the expense of the other. We presented the first set of data from Nigeria that comprehensively assessed quality of life in Nigerians with type 2 diabetes mellitus. We also validated the Bradley Wellbeing and Treatment Satisfaction questionnaires amongst indigenous Nigerians and produced the first version of the questionnaire in Yoruba language. We had hoped that our data will provide the basis for future comparisons and improving diabetes care. I'm glad, Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, to report that our paper accomplished this purpose, given the number of reprint requests and citations it generated. Working on this paper further stimulated interest in quality of life research, a relatively unexplored area at that time. I recall being stuck while working on the data on SPSS one evening. I had to go laptop in hand to Professor Segun Fatusi, a public health physician of renown, who then lived down the street at Aladanla here in Ile-Ife. It took him little or no effort to put me back on track. While doing the translation of the instrument to Yoruba, I had to enlist the assistance of another good friend and brother, Mr. Kolawole Jimo, whose sister studied Yoruba language. In yet another study, is shown in Table 6, we presented data comparing the quality of life effects of type 2 diabetes determined by the Bradley Wellbeing Questionnaire and the WHO Quality of Life generic instrument. This study showed how two different measures of quality of life performed in patients with type 2 diabetes. Even though the subscales of Wellbeing and WHO Quality of Life BREF were not very sensitive to external criteria of disease impact, that is complications, casting a doubt on their utility as psychological outcome measures, they demonstrated fairly reasonable internal consistency in our patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus. Diabetes complications research. We have contributed to the knowledge of diabetic foot syndrome, a terminology that covers a variety of problems afflicting the lower limbs of patients with diabetes mellitus. We investigated the etiology and antibacterial drug resistance body of infected diabetic foot ulcers in tertiary hospitals in Osun State, Nigeria, between July 2016 and April 2017. Specific resistance genes were detected by polymerase chain reaction. Factors associated with the presence of multi-drug resistant bacteria were peripheral neuropathy and the duration of the foot infection. In another study, we found a high frequency of symptomatic hypogonadism in men with type 2 diabetes, and the frequency increased with advancing age and visceral adiposity. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, We have examined the possibility that patients with concurrent type 2 diabetes and sickle cell trait may be predisposed to more frequent or severe diabetic micro or macrovascular conditions than those without SCT, an area not previously extensively researched. We found that male gender and sickle cell trait adversely affected the expression of microvascular diabetic complications in Nigerian diabetics. We concluded that the diabetic patients from populations predisposed to sickle cell gene should be screened for the trait as part of their initial risk assessment. The molecular mechanism of cell trait may accentuate microvascular disease damage in comorbid type 2 diabetes remains unclear. Sickle cell trait without any associated stress or comorbid state is asymptomatic and causes no sickling. It is, however, established that impaired exogenous and endogenous nitric oxide mediated vasodilatation, platelet hyperaggregability, and endotheliopathy with increased expression of soluble addition molecules are all characteristic features of diabetes mellitus. Mechanisms of disease, insulin resistance and beta cell function. Insulin resistance is a state in which a given concentration of insulin produces less than expected biological effect. Insulin resistance is defined as an impairment in insulin action that results in reduced glucose uptake by muscle and increased hepatic glucose production in the adipose tissue by increased lipolysis. Mr. Vice Chancellor, Sam, hazard diuretics, which form the bedrock of combination agreements in Africans and Blacks, have been shown to impair glucose tolerance on prolonged treatment. We assess the impact of hydrochlorothiazide, HCT, on beta cell function and insulin resistance, as well as any modification of this by lisinopril, an ACE inhibitor in Nigerian hypertensives. We also assess the influence of ethnicity and gender on this. We found no statistically significant difference in the metabolic effects of hydrochlorothiazide compared to HCT lisinopril combination after 12 unbroken weeks of treatment in Nigerian hypertensives. This is depicted in Table 6 and in Figure 6 and Table 8. Mr. Vice Chancellor Sam, in another study of 100 subjects with type 2 DM, we determined the levels of serum homocysteine and its association with insulin resistance among type 2 diabetic patients in our hospital. The study showed that homocysteine levels in type 2 DM was higher than amongst controls. Homocysteine levels was worsened by increasing insulin resistance, dyslipidemia, and worsening blood glucose control. Homocysteine levels is thus a potential cardiovascular risk marker in type 2 diabetic patients. In another dissertation I supervised, we assessed the insulin resistance and glucose tolerance abnormalities in patients with chronic liver disease and studied their relationship with the severity of chronic liver disease. We reported that glucose tolerance abnormalities and insulin resistance were highly prevalent among patients with chronic disease that we studied, and this seemed to parallel the severity of chronic liver disease as determined by the Child-Pugh score. Cardiovascular risk assessment, C-reactive protein. C-reactive protein is an acute phase protein produced in the liver. Its release is stimulated by cytokines, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. Elevated levels of it is a risk factor for coronary heart disease. We found that diabetics significantly higher serum C-reactive protein compared with apparently healthy controls. Also, there was a positive and significant correlation between C-reactive protein and fasting blood glucose among patients and controls. In another arm of the study, we observed a proportionately higher level of CRP among females than males, though it was not significant statistically. To study the risk of and the risk impact of high sensitivity C-reactive protein and plasminogen activator inhibitor 1, which are known risk factors for cardiovascular disease in the extreme hyperglycemic milieu observed in emergency settings. The mean values of high-sensitive CRP and plasminogen activator inhibitor 1 were higher in patients with hyperglycemic emergency compared to diabetic controls. We further investigated the pro-inflammatory cytokine interleukin 6 and the counter-regulatory hormone cortisol and their relationship with outcome in patients with hyperglycemic emergencies, with a view to determine putative mechanisms of the illness in Nigerians and perhaps possible interventions. We observed that hyperglycemia in Nigerians with HE is associated with more profound inflammatory response, characterized by higher interleukin 6 and cortisol. Perhaps treatment targeting this heightened response may be beneficial to the management of hyperglycemic emergencies. Vice Chancellor, sir, I now proceed to discuss gender influences on diabetic complications. We had observed subtle variations in the impact of gender on the clinical manifestation and outcome of diabetes in some earlier studies. I supervised Dr. Inaugural further exploration of the influence of gender on the distribution of two diabetic complications in our hospital. We determined the distribution according to gender of cardiometabolic risk profile, micro and macrovascular complications in patients with diabetes in the clinic setting. We found that women with type 2 diabetes had a worse cardiometabolic risk profile in terms of hypertension, obesity, and lipid goals, while men achieved therapeutic goals less frequently than did women in terms of glycemia. Microvascular and macrovascular conditions occurred commonly in both sexes, but there was a significant male predominance as severity of neuropathy worsened and female predominance as the severity of the retinopathy increased. We therefore recommended that treatment strategies should be intensified in both sexes, targeting attainment of glycemic control, blood pressure, and lipid goals. But women with diabetes may need more aggressive treatment of obesity. This is shown in tables 10 and 11. I will now proceed to discuss the International Diabetes Management Practices Study. The International Diabetes Management Practices Study, which was funded by Sanofi, is an multinational, multi-center, cross-sectional, and longitudinal observational study with yearly survey. The first wave of IJMPS was initiated in 2005. I was appointed as the national principal investigator for the 7th wave in 2016, though I had participated in the 6th wave as well. Our findings from the IJMPS type 1 study. Given the paucity of information on real-world management and challenges experienced by African adult patients with type 1 diabetes, we aim to describe a cohort of adults with type 1 from 12 African countries, unarguably one of the largest cohorts of type 1 DM ever studied on the African continent. We found that management of patients with type 1 was suboptimal. Identifying gaps in the real-world management of diabetes in Nigeria. In this part of the study, we posited that insulinization and subsidized healthcare can improve long-term diabetes outcomes in Nigeria. The third arm of that report dealt with health resource utilization among patients with type 2 diabetes in Nigeria. In that study, we assessed data on health resource utilization collected from patients with type 2 diabetes within the 7th wave of the IMDMPS. We found that low insurance coverage, high out-of-pocket payments for healthcare, said access to care. Physicians were overburdened, and medical resources trained in diabetes care seem insufficient. These findings highlight the need to formulate effective strategies to manage patients with type 2 diabetes. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, I will now discuss collaborations. In the course of my career and research in diabetology, I've been involved in many collaborations outside mainstream endocrinology that are worth being mentioned. Mr. Vice Chancellor, permit me to itemize a few. Ophthalmology. Diabetes mellitus is the leading cause of eye disease and blindness. It was thus a delight to us when Dr. now Professor Oluwatoyin Onakoya developed interest in diabetic eye disease, hence batting another vista in our string of collaborations outside broad internal medicine. We examined the prevalence of blindness, diabetic retinopathy, and other eye diseases in Nigerian diabetics. And we found a high prevalence of blindness, diabetic retinopathy, and other diseases in our type 2 diabetics. While health education, early diagnosis, as well as treatment of diabetic retinopathy and other diseases will largely alleviate these ocular morbidities. These interventions may continue to elude these patients for not so far-fetched reasons. More recently, and working with Dr. Imaokon's group, in the Department of Medical Biochemistry, we determined the levels of advanced glycation end products and malondialdehyde in Nigerian cataract patients with and without diabetes mellitus. Those with DM but no cataract, as well as apparently healthy controls, with a view to further elucidating pathophysiologic mechanisms for the occurrence of cataracts among our diabetic population. We determined the amount of vitamin C in the lenses of diabetic and non-diabetic patients with operable cataracts to ascertain association between vitamin C levels and blood glucose, glycated hemoglobin, and intraocular pressure. Levels of vitamin C found in both groups were much lower than what was previously reported in the literature for clear lenses. Pharmacognosy, medicinal plants, and their traditional applications continue to generate interest both to orthodox and alternative medicine practitioners in different parts of the world. I was therefore excited to work with Professor C. Adebayo of the Department of Pharmacy and his team in exploring the pharmacological activities of some native plants in animal studies. We evaluated the blood glucose lowering ability of the ashes of 7 plants that are used ethnomedicinally in Nigeria and whose organic extracts have been reported to possess anti-hyperglycemic activities, as well as compare the anti-hyperglycemic activities of A. muricata leaf extract and ash. Our report provided justification for the anti-diabetic ethnomedicinal use of plant ashes in Nigeria, while doses were recommended for the optimum folkloric use of these leaf ashes in managing diabetes in the rural areas of Nigeria. The leaf ashes may contain elements with insulin-stimulating properties. Technology. Technology diabetes are more or less conjoined twins, sharing the same vital organs, hence precluding separation. In conjunction with Dr. O.S. Anyolade and Dr. T.O. Oyebisi of the African Institute for Science Policy and Innovation, we studied the impact of HIT tools in the management of diabetes mellitus. In a work PhD thesis I co-supervised with Professor Oyebisi, the results from this study imply that for any diabetes management project to be successful, there is need to move from paper-based to HIT-based system in the entire organization. It is on record that this paper won the International Unlock Journal Award for publications in 2018. In another paper with Dr. Woyelu's team in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, we presented an approach to reducing the incidence of diabetes by predicting the risk of diabetes in patients. A diabetes mellitus risk prediction model was developed using supervised machine learning algorithms of naive Bayes, support vector machine, and J48 decision tree. In a related study with Dr. Ishaya Gambo, now of the University of Estonia, we formulated a mathematical model using carbohydrate counting, insulin requirements, and the Harris-Benedict energy equations to establish the framework for predicting and controlling blood glucose level regulation in type 1 diabetes. I have also been involved with collaborative studies with colleagues in dentistry, radiology, medical rehabilitation, and otorhinolaryngology, to mention a few. Thyroid disorders research. Thyroid disorders are medical conditions that affect the function of the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is located at the front of the neck and produces thyroid hormones that travel through the blood to help regulate many other organs, just like other hormones. Functions of thyroid hormones include regulating energy use, normal growth and development, and reproductive functions, amongst others. Most common ailments of the thyroid result in over or underproduction of hormone. We have contributed to the knowledge of cardiac involvement in thyroid toxicosis, one of the most detailed work on this in our locality. We have also contributed to the knowledge of the clinical characteristics of thyroid toxicosis peculiar to the environment in which we practice. In various studies of thyroid and its involvement in patients with sickle cell anemia, cardiac involvement, echocardiography findings, psychiatric manifestations, as well as general cardiovascular features. We have reported various manifestations of the disease in our locality. I now go on, Mr. Vice Chancellor, to discuss malaria research. It was Professor Ajayi that prompted my interest in malaria research. Owing to his background in clinical pharmacology, he had worked extensively on chloroquine-induced itch, and with his characteristic scientifically inquisitive mind, had sought an itch ameliorating strategy. Together, we researched into the mechanism of chloroquine-induced pruritus in malaria fever, and we demonstrated for the first time the involvement of micro-opiate receptors, endogenous opiate peptides in chloroquine-induced itching in humans with malaria fever. I later got involved with the African Malaria Network, which at that time was under the watch of Professor Wayne Kilama of the University of Dar es Salaam. I attended a couple of their malaria research meetings across the continent, and we had also planned further work on cutaneous opiate receptors in chloroquine-induced itch predisposition. However, my commitment to endocrinology truncated that vision. Service, university, endocrine, as well as the community. No sooner than I assumed duty as lecturer one in 1999, was I saddled with the responsibility for coordinating the postings and assessment of Part 4 students rotating through the department by my head of department, then Professor Professor Gregory Rabo. I was later appointed overall Part 4 coordinator for the MBCH program by Professor Balogun, who at that time was Dean of Clinical Sciences. This assignment brought me into close working relationship with colleagues in the Faculty of Basic Medical Sciences. I was vested with responsibility to draw timetables, conduct examinations, and process results through various boards and university committees. It was from this tasking job that Professor Lani Yonoyemi nominated me to be his Vice Dean in 2008. After completing 2 terms as Vice Dean, I did my own things for a while until Professor Adeshokun Fortitude as Provost seconded me to the Department of Dermatology and Venerology as head of department. I later served as substantive head of the Department of Medicine from 2018 to 2021. Towards the tail end of my tenure as head of medicine, I was elected provost of the College of Health Sciences, and I still occupy that position. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, I've also been privileged to offer service to the professional bodies to which I belong, including the Endocrine and Metabolism Society, where I served as past treasurer and vice president. I'm currently the president of the Association of Clinical Endocrinologists of Nigeria. I've also had the opportunity to sit on the Diabetes Advisory Board of notable pharmaceutical companies such as Sanofi, Novartis, Novo Nordisk, Boehringer Ingelheim, and AstraZeneca. Perhaps most important is the uncommon grace that I've received to be God's co-laborer in the vineyard of faith. I greatly value and cherish the opportunity to minister in the pastoral team of the New Covenant Church here in Ile-Ife. I acknowledge my spiritual mentors and disciples, Dr. Femi and Professor Fumi Shoeton, for their labor of love. I thank Reverend Oyelade, who appointed me to the board of the New Covenant Bible College in August 2021. Conclusion and recommendations. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, in concluding, permit me to quote once more from the 2011 write-up I did for the endocrinologist. By and large, endocrinology in Nigeria is rewarding, given our successes in reducing morbidity and mortality attributed to endocrine disorders. Though these successes require great effort, given the competition for government funding presented by other medical areas, particularly infection and other non-communicable diseases. The desires of basic infrastructure also do not help matters. It is hope that our fledgling health insurance system and the much anticipated transfer of technology will help ameliorate these challenges. Though this statement was penned 10 years ago, not so much ground has shifted in the ease of conducting research and practicing medicine in 2023. The contemporary researcher can no longer rely on the tools and strategies of the past. Good and impactful studies will require funding, which collaborative rather than individual efforts will attract. Several endocrinopathies, even though insidious in onset, sometimes lasting several years, causing noticeable symptoms, little or no noticeable symptoms, or even signs. So those seemingly innocuous, progressive, and at times irreversible tissue damage accompany the apparently silent face of these illnesses. Therefore, diseases that begin as apparently innocuous turn out to be sinister and possess sinister outcomes in the absence of intervention. I'm delighted to report today that our modest contribution to knowledge through research and innovation, through this research, we've been able to shed light on hitherto dark areas. Many lives have been impacted and saved. Hope has been restored where there was hopelessness. Myths have been debunked and truths have been reinforced. I'm equally proud, Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, that I've been able to nurture and pass to others what I myself received from those before me. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, in order to continue to attract and retain the very best, our government should incentivize specialists and specialist trainees. This will stem the ugly tide of brain drain with attendant loss of a critical mass of our inadequate workforce. Given the chronic nature of most endocrinopathies and their associated comorbidities, healthcare expenses can be impoverished if borne by sufferers alone. Governmental support through subsidies for medications such as insulin and hormone replacement therapies are urgently required. Access to care should and must be guaranteed regardless of an individual's place of domicile or socioeconomic status. Our health insurance system requires revamping to meet the yearnings and aspirations of end users. The private sector should also complement the effort of government by providing patient support strategies based on health information systems and appropriate technology. Mr. Vice Chancellor, sir, I will now proceed to take acknowledgements. Nothing captures my testimony better than the words of Apostle Paul in the 10th verse of the 15th chapter of his letter to the Corinthians. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace towards me has not been in vain. To God be all the glory. I thank my supervisors and trainers, Professor Adewale Akinshola, Professor Olabode Balogun, Professor Ade Ajayi, Professor Fedayo Owurele, and the late Professor T.O. Johnson. I'm grateful to my seniors and peers in the Department of Medicine, including Professor Irabo, Professor Ndububa, Professor Ikem, Professor Akitomide, Professor Shanusi Arogunade, and Professor Komalafi Anadebayo. I'm grateful to my friend and colleague, Dr. Shofo, who bought my first endocrinology textbook for me in the US and shipped it to Nigeria. My gratitude also goes to the university and University Children's Hospital for providing the enabling environment for folks like us to thrive. I must not fail to mention and acknowledge all my colleagues in the endocrinology unit of OAU, OETC, my past and present residents and students. You are all part of my success story. I deeply appreciate my dad, Emeritus Professor Lawrence Babatope Kolawole, an excellent role model, astute academic, and pillar of immense support. I dedicate this lecture to his persistent nudging and promptings. I thank God for sparing his life to witness today's event, having himself presided over several inaugural lectures as the Vice Chancellor of the Federal University of Technology, Akure, in the 90s. In like manner, I celebrate my mom, Mrs. Eunice Adejumoke Kolawole, for her doting care, incessant phone calls to check on every single one of us, and our unceasing prayers. Mommy can really pray. I thank my sibling, Oluremi, and her husband, Olabode. Oluremi had flown all the way from the US to be here today. I thank you. Babatunde and Oyenike, who also flew in from Boni to be here today. Babalola and Bola, Tokumbo and Eyi, you have all been fantastic. My heartfelt and profound gratitude goes to my mother-in-law, Mrs. Eyitayo Bamimore, who practically did all the last stages of my residency training with me in Lagos. May the good Lord reward your labor of love. I thank my sister-in-law, Omalara, Ayo and Bola. Thank you so much for your support. How can I say thank you to the love of my life? Ikelomo Adebanke, in words, you have been my manager, chief of staff, and Minister of Domestic and External Affairs. A stickler for detail and perfection. Many daughters have done well, but you excel them all. I'm immensely grateful for all you do, and to my children, Babatope, who also flew in from the US to be here, Ayokumi, and Ayomikun. I say thank you for being proper children and giving us the time and space to flourish. I thank all my friends, well-wishers, and my inaugural lecture planning committee for their contribution and support. May God bless you all, and thank you so much for listening.
Who are you? You want everyone. Who are you? You want everyone. You want I ain't got no time to watch the humankind. I only want to be almighty. From birth I have learned to give respect to everything He created. I give love, give it love. So give it all. I love those ways. I say, I give to the man. Give to those who in the wall. I love those who hate me. I give those who curse me. I'm showing respect. Feel some respect. Some respect. Respect for who I am and for what I am. It's words about your daughters. I am words about our feeling plain. To those who give you love, to those who give you all. You to those who hate you, even those who curse you. Even those who curse I want to something to spend. Show me.